Have you ever felt misunderstood? Have you ever been confused as to why others can't just use common sense? I think we might have some answers for you today in this episode of Required Readings Top 100.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Required Readings Top 100. In these videos, we discuss our favorite books and why we think you should be reading them. So what is your choice for this week?
My choice this week is The Culture Map by Erin Meyer. I read this about five and a half years ago. I wasn't doing much. It was the middle of the pandemic, so I had a few extra hours per day on my hands. And this book was very, very fascinating. Its whole premise is really this idea that we can't assume somebody understands what we're saying or what we're doing based off of just our knowledge of what we're doing. So, or even like our culture's knowledge of what we're doing. So there could be an instance where in an office in the US or in Canada or wherever, where you just have like this underlying understanding of the procedures and what's going on, what you're talking about. But when you start to layer on perhaps a teammate or a company or like a different office in a different country, you start to layer on slightly different cultural understandings of the norms per se. And it goes through, I want to say it like tracks around 8 different cultures. So Japanese culture, Chinese culture, Dutch culture, German culture, American culture. I think Canada is thrown in there as well. And there is, they definitely throw in some Southern, so some Spanish and maybe some Latin American culture in there. But she has this really cool way of sort of mapping the cultures. And there's a bunch of different charts in here when she's talking about, so this is low context explicit versus high context implicit. So essentially really talking about exactly what you're talking about rather than knowing that the unspoken is still understandable. But as you can see, there are these quadrants per se, where they have like low context, high context, indirect negative feedback, and then direct negative feedback. And she starts to sort of map the cultures on there where you can start to see that, okay, well, in the Netherlands, they are a direct negative feedback and a low context or very explicit way that checks. And versus, in China, they have indirect negative feedback and everything is very implicit. So if there is negative feedback, it's sort of implied and you don't get that directness of, no, I don't like that idea. It's maybe a reaction of, and you're like based off of your culture, you're just meant to understand that, okay, actually, no, that was not a good idea. So she goes through, again, those cultures, but she also touches on different aspects of culture, of interacting with each other. So she goes through politeness, and there's different forms of politeness. There's varying degrees of politeness. There's also respect. Obviously, that is very, very different depending on what culture you're from, what culture you're in. And then she goes into trust, or the building of trust. And in some cultures, it's a little bit more difficult as an outsider to come in and build that trust, because the trust is built up through maybe even generations of family connections, of business connections. And so you as the outsider are seen as obviously foreign, but untrustworthy. And it's really, really hard to penetrate those cultures or those circles to create that level of trust, which makes doing business a little bit harder, or it makes working in a foreign country a little bit harder based off of that as well. And then there's, of course, feedback, which we just touched upon in that quadrant of negative feedback or direct negative feedback versus indirect negative feedback, where again, in the Netherlands, they're very easy, or they're very quick to say, no, that idea is not going to work. versus, again, maybe somewhere in Japan, it might be a little bit less verbal. It could be more of like a body language type of thing. And then it comes into decision making, which I actually find the most fascinating because I have been able to sort of split my time in two different cultures where I definitely experienced this on both sides of this idea, where there are principles first cultures and then application first cultures. So in the United States, in Canada, when you are giving a presentation, you kind of start with the punchline. You kind of start with what we're going to do, and then you say, this is why we're going to do it. Versus in a more European culture, it is more of a principles first. So you start to lead with the research and you start to almost like build your case. And then you hit that last slide where you say like, this is what we're going to do based off of all of this previous information. So when you are kind of switching cultures and you do what you're comfortable with, it comes across as either unprofessional, or it comes across as maybe a little grating or a little abrupt, or it just kind of incongruous with the expectations that they might have in that culture. Obviously, as you know, I got my master's degree in Norway, and one of the most difficult things to kind of come to terms with was not only their grading scale, because, no one gets an A over there. And, being Canadian, being American, it was really hard. It was a hard pill to swallow where, no, I really just was average and a C is what I got. But, even asking for feedback, even asking like, hey, is there anything that I can do differently that will allow me to get a higher grade? And the answers were always like, no, you're doing great. You're doing fine. You're doing fine. And really it was this idea, or I think it was this idea of like, I was writing in an active voice versus in Norway, academically, they write more of a passive voice. And so it was this underlying knowledge that was not spoken because it was so cultural that they perhaps didn't know that it needed to be spoken. So obviously I read this a long time after I finished my master's degree. And so it was interesting and maybe affirming that I wasn't going crazy, that there actually were differences. But at the time, I really didn't have the knowledge or the words to make it understandable to myself, let alone to other people around me. So definitely, I recommend this book again to everyone. And I actually really have recommended this book at least 5 times in the last 5 years since I have read it. I think that it not only, it's the cultural or the culture map, and you think about globalization, you think about all of these different cultures, but I really do think that some of these things can be helpful just even in your own culture and understanding, okay, well, maybe they were raised a different way, or maybe they had a set of parents that were from a different culture. So then there's like a whole different nuance of communication, misunderstandings, understandings, pitfalls, and all of the above.
Well, it's funny, yeah. So you kind of answered that. My question was going to be that, why should someone read this? And you sort of touched on that. You actually touched on that a little bit. So, I think sometimes maybe, especially for those of us who maybe work in a more globalized economy, meaning that we do work with people from different cultures, different nationalities and different cultures. So you might be an American working with someone in Ireland, or you might work for a multinational company. And so you find yourself working with people from different really vastly different cultures. But for the average person, what do you think they can get out of this that would help them in their lives? And I'm thinking more specifically in a sort of more localized sort of culture or economy. Like, what can you get out of this, and how can you apply some of the lessons you may get from this book in a more sort of localized cultural landscape?
Yeah. I think that if we are just talking about maybe the US is a very, very large country. And there are regions and there are differences between those regions. I'm from the Pacific Northwest. There's definitely differences when I moved to New York. The Northeast culture is very different. I've spent some time in the Southwest. Unfortunately, I've never really gone to the Southeast. So I've never been to Alabama. I've never been to Florida. I haven't been to the Carolinas. So I haven't had that experience yet. But I do think that even within one country, there are, like you say, like differences even within that local society. So if you are coming, or maybe you are maybe you're like even just traveling, you're experiencing a different side of the country, then it might be easier to understand, the differences and be a little less quick to judge or to apply a label. My favorite one is that, all New Yorkers are crabby and that they're rough around the edges. But I actually, and you've heard me say this before, I actually think that New Yorkers are really kind, but they're not nice. So my example is, if you get a flat tire on the highway and you're, stranded on the side of the road, a New Yorker will stop and they'll help you change your tire. They'll be yelling at you the entire time. Like, you're a stupid moron. Why the hell did you, not have blah, blah, blah. But they'll still, they'll help you. Versus if you are on the other side of the country in perhaps LA, sorry guys, they're nice, but they're not kind. So they might be that superficial of, hey, how you doing? It's amazing. You're so awesome. But then,
they won't stop to help you on the side of the road.
Yeah, they won't stop to help you change your tire. They'll, maybe roll down their window and be like, that sucks, man. Yeah. So, I mean, not to bash people from LA, I'm sorry. But you just do see those cultural differences, and maybe understanding those cultural differences, even within one country, can help you maybe not take it so personally.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that, for instance, the U.S., I think we tend to look at the U.S. as a sort of monoculture, but that's not really true. And you can have even differences between one town to the next town. So a lot of the towns are sort of siloed, and they have very small sort of cultural norms that you may not even realize that are very localized. So I think that's true.
You even see it in smaller European countries. Yeah. I mean, there's a vast difference between the north of the Netherlands versus the south of the Netherlands. I think you see it in Spain too.
Oh, absolutely.
Germany, absolutely. I mean, you definitely have a different culture within Berlin. I think
versus
there's
Munich.
Versus Munich, exactly. I think there's some vestiges of, World War II and everything that went on within, 1945 to 89, 90. But even within smaller countries, there's still those regional underlying understandings kind of thing.
Well, I mean, even in the Netherlands, the way that you speak the language,
sure,
Dutch, there are sort of differences that mark you out. Or even in London, where you have your accent sort of really keys people in as to where in London are you from.
Yeah.
And then there's certain sayings. So I think that's true in Spain. You have different languages for sure. So one of the things, as I was sort of thinking about this book, that I thought was interesting is, you sort of look at cultures and you kind of try to map out the way the cultures function. You mentioned how in Chinese culture, negative criticism tends to be implicit, not explicit. Whereas in Dutch culture, it tends to be explicit rather than implicit, negative feedback. So it can be very front-facing. In Spain, there's sort of socialization is a big thing. That's one of the ideas about Spanish culture. But then on the other side of that, how do you avoid the pitfalls of stereotyping? How does the book handle that? And if the book maybe doesn't sort of talk about that, how do you sort of handle those pitfalls? How do you deal with assumptions about cultures that maybe you've done your research and you feel that there's a certain way that you have to bow to a Japanese businessman, but that Japanese businessman who does business all over the world doesn't actually bow? How do you deal with that, and how does it navigate stereotypes?
Yeah. I don't remember if it does navigate stereotypes. But I do think that we all have a level of bias. And I think that just recognizing our level of bias is actually the most important thing. So there might be an anomaly to a culture where, as your example was, a Japanese businessman might not participate in bowing or anything, but maybe that's not the feature, but that's a bug. So that would be like the anomaly itself. So, yeah, I mean, even if that does happen, recognizing, oh, I have a bias to thinking that it could happen this way. It's interesting that it didn't. It's interesting that, I came into this meeting with some expectations. I'm walking out with totally different expectations, but also just not even also acknowledging that you have that bias coming in, that you have that stereotype. And this might be controversial, but I'm not sure if stereotypes are always a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking that through, so I have nothing to back it up.
Okay.
But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, stereotypes can be dangerous, but
they can.
But they also can help in, sometimes stereotypes are based on some foundational truths about a culture. You got to be very careful.
Yeah.
We have to be very careful with that. But some things are sort of known about cultures. Like, for instance, in Islamic culture or Muslim culture, understanding modesty as a sort of, okay, it's a stereotype. You could say it's a stereotype. There's these notions about modesty, but it's really important to understand them, because if you know some of these rules and you understand it, you know that, or rather some of these quote unquote stereotypes, you know how to behave or have a sense of how you should behave around certain people. And, that can get very complicated and also very tricky, but I think it's kind of it's kind of important. So I think I have one more question, which I think is going back to what can people take from this book, and what they can use in their own lives across all facets of their life. I mean, this book, I think, focuses more on essentially sort of the workplace.
Yeah, it does.
But I think it can probably apply to many different scenarios. But what do you think in this book is the single most actionable habit that someone can enact in their own lives to allow them to be able to interact with people from different cultures, whether they're local cultures or international cultures?
I think from this book, but also other books that I've read too, is not to take things too personally. I said it a few years ago, but no one's thinking about you.
Right. Right.
You are actually thinking more about yourself and how you are actually acting, and they're thinking more about themselves and how they're actually acting. So the focus isn't on you. You can relax a little bit. Know that there are going to be some differences and be aware of those differences, but then not beating yourself up that you did the wrong thing or that you misunderstood something, because sure, it's going to happen. But now you might know a little bit more, but again, they're probably not thinking about you as much as you think they're thinking about you.
Right. So when a Dutch person is being direct, it does not mean that they're insulting you.
Maybe not.
So that's something to take away from all of this. It's not about you. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Required Readings Top 100. This week we talked about the culture map, decoding how people think, lead, and get things done across the cultures. So let us know what you think about this. Have you encountered any situations where there were maybe some cultural faux pas that you tripped over and you're deeply embarrassed about? I know I have a few, actually, which I didn't talk about in this video. What are some examples in your life or in your career where you've had to apply knowledge about cultures? Let us know in the comments below, and see you again next time.
If you made it this far, make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you are notified of any upcoming episodes. It's free for you, but it means the world to us.